Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Spark Labs Smart Cities webinar. If you're in Asia, good morning, enjoy your coffee. If you're in the US, good evening, hope you're having a glass of wine or a gin and tonic. So this is another Spark Labs webinar. So Spark Labs is a group of startup accelerators and venture capital funds. And it's now running these series of accelerators where we bring together some of our contacts and talk about some of the things going on in the world of technology. So today we're going to cover smart cities, and the next one's going to be coming up on August 19th, so mark your calendar, and we're going to be covering the future of mobility. So I'm Charles Reed Anderson, and I'm the managing partner for Spark Labs Connects, which is a new smart city accelerator and fund based in Singapore, and I'm going to be your moderator today. So I'll talk a little bit at the beginning, but hopefully we'll listen to the experts more. So I'm pleased to be joined by 4 different panelists today, each of whom has spent many years working in the smart cities ecosystem. So to start off, we've got Emily Yates, who has a background in urban planning and is now the Smart City Director for the City of Philadelphia. Her experience across both the supply and demand sides of the smart cities ecosystem will provide us with some unique insights, and I look forward to hearing her opinions on how the super cities versus super suburbs debate is going to go. Next, we have Brandon Walsh joining us from Palo Alto, where he's the Director of International Affairs for Stanford University. And when you hear about smart cities, you're going to hear a lot about public-private partnerships. So what Brendan's going to talk about is the role that higher education plays in those partnerships. Next, we move down to LA, and we have John Rossant joining us, where he's the founder and chairman of the New Cities Foundation, a global nonprofit institution dedicated to improving the quality of life and work in cities. And he's also the CEO of CoMotion, a global platform that brings together innovative transport and tech companies to drive the future of mobility. In addition to all of those, he's also an advisor to NEOM, which is a greenfield smart city initiative in Saudi Arabia, which is designing a city for the future. And finally, in Singapore, we've got Tim Kobe. So Tim's the founder and CEO of 8 Inc., which is a global design firm that has worked with some of the world's leading brands, including Apple, Virgin Atlantic, Nike, Nissan, and Xiaomi. And he helps them transform their customer experience. And Tim just cringed when I said that because he would hate that I called it the customer experience, because that oversimplifies it. What Tim really does is help companies and cities transform the human experience. So we'll learn more about what his role is with cities and the new developments going forward. So that's enough from me. It's time to hear from the experts. And we're going to start off by going to Emily. So Emily, you've had roles across the smart city ecosystem, doing the planning side, and now you're on the implementation side. So what are some of the challenges that cities face when delivering these initiatives?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on this conversation. I'm excited to be with everybody here. There is a plethora of things that we could pick from that cities have challenges with. I'll go with the top 3 that I see kind of consistent across cities. The first one is partnerships. That I think cities often don't give enough value to partnerships, but really, if you're looking to deploy and implement smart cities, you need to have partnerships. It needs to be a public-private plus partnership. You need to have not only the private sector, but the plus being utilities and universities at the table. You can't do it on your own, and you will not be successful if you try. But that also brings other challenges that we see in Philadelphia, and that I saw in some of my roles, was that there's an education gap between private sector innovators, entrepreneurs, and how to work with cities. A lot of times there's a challenge in that space as well. Cities are a beast. I'm on the inside, and there's still some challenges to understanding how cities work. We have protocols, we have processes that we have to follow. Nothing moves fast, which is the complete opposite of innovation. There's a lot of pieces that have to fall into place. Decisions can't be made rapid fire like they can in the private sector. And so I think there's sometimes a tension around that in partnerships. Another one would be procurement. I think we spoke about that earlier. It is a cumbersome process in a city, and every city is trying to figure out a way to improve their procurement process so that it keeps it same rate as innovation. And then the other one I would say is the willingness to absorb risk rather. Cities are not risky individuals. That's why we look to the private sector. That's why we look to partnerships. But if a city can figure out how to absorb that risk of innovation and testing and piloting and trying out their technologies, I think that they will have much more success in that smart city space. And Just a little plug for Philadelphia. We actually have a program called Pitch and Pilot that's set up to do all three of those things, to address all of those challenges in the city. It's to create a more transparent process of partnership with innovators and entrepreneurs, but also universities as research partners. It's a process where my program, the Smart City PHL program, partners with other departments in the city to say, what is your challenge? Let us know. We'll help you find the right technology and solution, and then we'll pilot it and assess it and, you know, kind of take the metrics of it and determine if it's successful or not. So we'll absorb that risk in the Office of Innovation and Technology. And then we utilize a miscellaneous purchase order to help get around that contract and procurement challenge. So
the risk thing you brought up is very interesting, because I work with a number of cities across Asia, and they're very risk averse. I think the only one I've really seen that's gotten over that hump would be Taipei. And they implemented a strategy to really help them test out proof of concepts. You know, normally in cities, you do a few proof of concepts a year. They take a long time. I think they cranked out 175 proof of concepts over a couple of years. So they really had to change the culture at its core, which isn't that easy when we get into cities.
Yeah.
And the other thing you mentioned was about public-private partnerships, and that's a great lead-in to go over to Brendan. So when we had our chat recently, you know, we were talking about the role that Stanford plays in the smart city ecosystem. And I was fascinated by one of the projects that you're going to be working on, which is up in Incheon, South Korea. So everyone thinks of Stanford out in Palo Alto, but you guys are really branching out around the world. So can you tell us a little bit about that initiative and how it came about, and how Stanford and Incheon can both benefit from the partnership?
Yeah, sure. So if you think of a smart city as a living laboratory, this literally was Stanford's chance to build a lab within a lab. So we received a government subsidy to do smart cities research on the smart city itself. So the current project grew out of the Incheon Global Campus Initiative, which was made possible though when the Incheon Free Economic Zone shifted from a singular focus on attracting US degree granting institutions as a way of, you know, attracting talent, to also trying to attract US research institutions. And the goal was for the research to benefit Korea and drive their smart cities initiatives. So it was great because it's right at the nexus of where I've been working for the past 20 years with government, industry, and higher education. So this first project, we're literally trying to figure out how to finance smart cities. We know smart cities are going to be really expensive to build. It's on an order of magnitude larger than dumb cities, for lack of a better word, but less connected cities. But we don't actually know how expensive. And we also don't quite yet know how expensive they're going to be to operate and maintain. Right? And so this is the perfect kind of partnership for private sector and government to collaborate with higher education. So we're trying to figure out what kind of data will help municipalities predict their costs of operation. What kind of data will help them attract bond investors, which is typically how governments, you know, fund major infrastructure projects. And, you know, will lower operating and borrowing costs help municipalities expand their tax base? Are they going to attract industry, you know, new residents to the city that will expand their tax base and make their bonds, you know, more stable and more attractive for investors as well? So while universities are typically slow at technology transfer that can scale quickly, they are very good at testing new technology and designing rigorous models to test policy and, you know, economic questions. And of course, universities also generate the kind of talent and graduates that feed ecosystems that are necessary to sustain the kind of investments that will be needed for smart cities. So that's kind of how we're thinking about the first project that we'll be implementing in Songdo.
Okay, very good. Well, we do know a little bit about how much they cost, because there have been some greenfield city developments. So we have Songdo, which is right next to Incheon, and I believe that project cost about 35 to 40 billion US dollars. But that kicked off about 17 years ago. And back then it was billed as a city of the future. So if you fast forward to today, John is actually working on one of the other cities of the future, which is Neom City in Saudi Arabia. So can you tell us a bit about that project and how the future cities have actually changed over the years, or what our view of those cities of the future are?
I mean, Neom is, I mean, it's in a way the really big greenfield city of all time. It's, you know, $500 billion. What sets it apart from a city like Songdo, which I know well since we organized an annual meeting of our New Cities Foundation there in 2017, which was very, very successful. What what's interesting about Songdo is that it's a very successful example of a big greenfield smart city. And a city built from scratch. Why has it been successful? Because it's right next to Incheon Airport, which is one of the great hubs of North Asia now, and it's not that far from Seoul. Neom is literally in the middle of nowhere. It's in the northwest quadrant of Saudi Arabia, along the Red Sea. It's not reclaimed land, but it's very virgin land in the sense that almost no one lives there. And it's the size of Belgium or Israel geographically. It's a very large landmass. So the Saudi government a few years ago decided to develop this as a smart city, smart greenfield city, real emphasis on technology. And I think one of the ideas was to use it to help develop all of Saudi Arabia. So it could be a kind of model for a post-oil economy. What's different about Neom, in my view, and what's interesting about it, is that it's really the first large greenfield city project of the 21st century that takes into account in its planning the two big mega trends of this century. And what are they? One is, of course, the transition away from carbon and hydrocarbon as a fuel source, as the energy transition. And two, it's about the mobility revolution, the revolution in mobility and transportation, how people and goods move around cities. And, we think that this is being fundamentally disruptive in very, very important ways. And if you think about how cities are laid out, certainly over the last century or so, the architecture of cities, not architecture, but the form of cities, the urban geography, it depends on the motor car, whether it's freeways here in Los Angeles, et cetera. Cities of the future will be very, very different because mobility will become autonomous. It's becoming shared already. It will be decarbonized, it will be electric. So what's interesting about Songdo, in some ways, very, very impressive as a smart city. And there's some wonderful technologies that are put to work there. But the basic model and form is still very much a city of the last century, similar to the vast boulevards that go across it. It's like Sheikh Zayed Road in Dubai, and these are very 20th century sort of conceptual ideas of what a city is about. So I think Neom, the way it's being planned, and I don't want to reveal too much, but it will be a completely post-car city, a post-internal combustion engine city. They will not be allowed in Neom. Not only that, but it also takes into account the fact that nature is there. And I think we forget about nature and the sort of the natural world when we're in cities. Neom is being designed so that at any point in the city, you're only a 7 or 8 minute walk from kind of absolute nature, untouched nature. And the way the urban development is being planned is that it will leave 98% of the land surface of Neom completely untouched, which I think is very, very interesting. So it's an exciting project. It's, one of the things I think that's important that we're discovering in Neom is that, infrastructure, smart infrastructure, technology, obviously key, but in some ways, even more important is the regulatory and the legal framework that can allow this to happen. And, Emily, you talked about, the slowness of procurement, et cetera. And I think that's being very carefully looked at Neom. And there's a completely new legal framework for what will essentially be a new city-state. The underlying law will be its own law. It will not be Saudi Arabian law. So I think it's done with the idea that NEOM wants to attract knowledge workers and smart investment from around the world. And so you're creating a legal environment that's very attractive to that. So that's really important when you're building, especially when you're building a greenfield city. And there's a real difference between sort of brownfield development and greenfield development, of course. So yeah, no, it's very, very exciting.
So the challenge we do have, though, is we can't just knock down all of our cities and build everything greenfield. So we do have to work with our existing city structures as well. So it's always exciting to see what you can do in these greenfield environments. But then the challenge is, what do we do when we have existing infrastructure? So it'll be fun to see how that plays out. And Tim, so you've been looking at this quite a bit as well. So you've been branching out and working on developments like the One Bangkok project in Bangkok, obviously. But also you've been working on Singapore's Design 2025 Master Plan that sort of looks about how Singapore needs to change in the future. So can you give us some ideas about the type of work you do and how cities can actually transform the human experience?
Yeah, sure, Charles. The work that we're doing currently in Singapore, you mentioned the Design 2025 Master Plan, was really looking at tasking a team of people to look at how a design mindset can really help to benefit what the future of Singapore could look like. So you're looking at existing infrastructure. I had written a piece on Lee Kuan Yew, one of the founding fathers in Singapore, and rather through the lens of him being a politician, through the lens of him being a designer. And the idea that the decisions that he made along the way, very much in my view, reflected the way a design mindset would craft a successful outcome. And I think one of the biggest pieces there is rather than the usual metrics of the types of things his political policies achieved, the idea that we had to deal with both rational and emotional aspects of a successful city. We tend to get caught up a lot in the tactics, and we tend to frame success through the lens of first being what are the human outcomes of success, the strategy that delivers those human outcomes, and then ultimately what are the tactics that support the strategy to deliver those outcomes. So consistently laddering back up to human outcomes. And so framing the mindset in a way that empowered everybody within the city to come from a legacy. If you're a Singaporean, you have a legacy from Lee Kuan Yew of a successful nation state, but moving it from not just being livable, not just being functional, but to being lovable, that it's a place people want to be part of, people want to connect with. And I think we tend to miss that part of the conversation, particularly in smart city development. We lose sight of the fact that the point of a city is for people to successfully live together. And so I think that document helps to set out some of the parameters, how we infuse it in the education, how we empower the elderly people in the country who were there during the founding of it to participate and share in defining its future. So I think the plan is one that was looking at a successful city, but much more from a human outcome perspective and what would be the parameters that would frame that.
And hopefully more cities start to take that approach, because I think we know as well, a lot of the cities are very tactical on this. And it's very just cost driven, do it as cheaply as possible. And it's always great when they can set that type of a vision and aspirations to bring people into these cities and make them want to stay there. And this is a great lead in to the topic we have today, because we need to make our cities livable and people want to be there. But the topic today is, are we moving from an era of super cities to the super suburbs? And also what I'd like to cover is this really a US or Western phenomenon? Because what we see in Asia is actually mass urbanization right now. So we're already home to 26 megacities. So those are cities with 10 million plus population. And that's going to rise to 33 by the year 2025. And to put it in perspective, there's only 49 in total. So, but all these stats were pre-COVID. Now what we have is companies like Amazon, Google, Facebook, telling employees that they can work from home until earlier mid 2021. So has the world changed forever? And is it going to be a race to the suburbs? And if so, what does that mean to the urban centers? And probably a great person to start with on this is Emily, because you are in a city and you're running the planning on this. So has this been a trend that you've been looking at in Philadelphia? And if so, what impact do you anticipate it having?
So it's interesting. This has popped up a lot. I think what I'm seeing is that this conversation is very anecdotal, but I haven't seen any like official numbers on it. In my opinion, it's probably unique to cities like San Francisco and New York City, where you already had underlying issues like overpriced small apartments. And when you're stuck in quarantine, who wants to be paying a ton of money in these small, cramped apartments when you don't have to physically be at work and you have limited access to a city's amenity? And I think part of the reason people live in cities is because they like the amenities and whatnot. But for me, and kind of the lens through which we're looking at a lot of our work in Philadelphia, where we are unfortunately known as the largest poorest city in the United States. We have a 25% of our population at or below poverty level here in Philadelphia. The bigger issue for us here is that if that is happening, it's a privileged population that is able to do this. So we are trying to focus more on those communities that can't. And generally, since these people can afford to leave, we would hope that when the pandemic's over, they would, I would imagine they'd want to move back to Philadelphia. So we're not really actively looking at this trend. We are seeing a shortage of housing on the market and bidding wars, which is usually kind of a sign, right? But is that because people don't want to move during a quarantine, or is it because we have people from New York City moving to Philadelphia because we're only 2 hours south and close proximity to New York City? No one knows. So what we've really been doing is just focusing on utilizing data and deploying infrastructure and technology that can be done in an inclusive and equitable way. And a great example of that actually, which speaks to a lot of the stuff that my peers have been speaking about, is a partnership that I'm doing with Penn Praxis, which is the University of Pennsylvania's consulting branch, and Dr. Mariela Alfonso, who is a New Cities Placemaking Fellow, where we're looking to essentially implement a transdisciplinary, data and tech-driven, community-led, all those great buzzwords, approach to co-develop a scalable, transformative, place-based tool. Because what we're realizing is you can't have these community gatherings, right? So how are we engaging community with technology in times of social distancing and quarantine to help empower them to co-create livable, equitable, and resilient communities? Because if anything has happened with this COVID and the Black Lives Matter protests that we're having in cities in the US, is that it's amplified these spatial inequities that we're seeing in cities, and that they weren't designed for everybody to live successfully together. And so it's important to us to do projects like this, where we're really working with the community, ensuring that there's an equitable representation and it's an inclusive process, but able to use that data and that technology and do some education around that to help improve how we work as a government.
Okay. And now, Brendan, you're out in San Francisco area, but you're down in Palo Alto, so sort of the suburbs already. But you also look at this globally because your role is international affairs for Stanford. So how do you see this trend playing out?
I think it's a global trend, and I'll say that with one caveat. So if you look at just climate change and you look at rising sea level, there are estimates out there that by 2050, approximately 155 million people globally are going to have to move out of low-lying areas. By 2100, that's something north of 225 million people. There's no government that can just print that much money to move those people and build new cities. So they're going to have to attract investors. And so in that sense, it's a global problem. But climate change is not going to only affect coastal areas, it's going to affect other cities as well. We're going to need smart solutions that can be not just scaled up for mega cities, but also scaled down for smaller cities. And when you look at what has been happening, people moving, the giant exurbs of San Francisco Bay Area, we're going to need to find solutions from smart city research that can be scaled down, that can serve those communities as well and just be dispersed widely. So that's why I say it's a global trend with caveats. I don't think it's all a move towards mega cities necessarily.
Looks like we have a little bit of a problem with Brendan.
Oh no.
Or it's locked up.
I see everybody else moving.
Okay, so it was me, sorry.
Okay. Did you catch the end of the other panelists catch the end of that?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay. Good. Sorry about that. It was my side. John, you also look at this globally. So how do you see it? I mean, especially when you look at maybe the Middle East and if you're looking at Saudi Arabia, do you see a trend more of urbanization or this move to the suburbs? Or is it more like a decentralized where there's many central business districts around a city?
You know, Middle East, sort of Asia, South Asia, you know, there's still a tsunami of populations moving to urban areas, which is in contrast to, you know, North America, where we're probably about as urbanized as we'll ever get, or Latin America, you know, around sort of 75, 80%. You know, going back to, I think one of the interesting trends that we're tracking quite closely is the whole discussion and conversation around mixed use. Because, you know, if you think about certainly European, particularly North American cities, how they're zoned is so important. And, you know, the whole zoning itself dates back 100 years or more. And it does not particularly reflect modern realities, today's realities, and I think still less the realities of tomorrow. So, you know, we simply have to, I think, move towards, you know, much more mixed use, adaptive reuse. I think that's, you know, that's going to happen in every big city. First of all, if, you know, if we're going to see a collapse or a real decline in commercial real estate as a result of COVID and result of remote working, et cetera, companies downsizing their offices and downtown business districts, you're just going to have to repurpose a lot of that, those structures for residential. And we really need to do that. I think one of perhaps the silver linings of this horrific crisis that, you know, our urban world, our entire world is in because of COVID, is that I think it will accelerate this kind of discussion around rethinking zoning, rethinking this sharp divide between commercial and residential use of buildings and neighborhoods. So I'm you know, all for that. And I think if we see also recently in Europe, particularly, there's been a very, very interesting rise in this idea of the 15-minute city, which is, you know, in the future, one should be sort of a 15-minute, more or less, walk or bike ride from your work, from the supermarket, from public spaces, et cetera. And if you look at the kind of pedestrianization of inner city thoroughfares in Milan and Paris over the past few months, I mean, those are likely to stay. So I think we see that this is a movement that's going to gather steam over the next few years, I believe. So we're going to see cities that are much more complicated, mixed use, you can live over the shop, et cetera. So that's particularly, I think, in, you know, North America and Europe. Asia is sort of on its own track. And, you know, one of the things, you know, I'm convinced history will not look kindly on the Chinese rush to urbanization. I think it's been incredibly badly planned. And, you know, if you take any train ride in China, you know, it's horrific. In rural areas, you know, they're just high rises after anonymous high rises. And I think those will be really pretty terrible places to live in about 20 years. As you know, they don't reflect, I think, what, you know, people's culture and the way people live, et cetera. And they're pretty horrific. So I'm certainly worried about that in the long run in China.
It is. I've got a chance to go to a lot of those rural cities. It is quite interesting when you get there. This, as far as you can see, high rises that all basically look the exact same. So hopefully they'll take a plan out of your book and start looking at how to do this better. Another interesting thing that happened during the crisis and during the lockdowns in Europe that I was tracking, a lot of cities started to actually take up some road space and put in more dedicated bike lanes. So I like seeing that side of it as well. And that'll help people get around easier, but also push them, you know, if people are scared to go on public transport, it gives them another thing. So Now I want to go over to Tim, because if there is a move to the super suburbs, does that mean, since we both live in a city state of Singapore, does that mean we have to move to Malaysia or Indonesia to find a suburb? Because we don't really have suburbs here. But more specifically, I know you have offices across 3 different continents. So how is it impacting your different offices? What do you see from the people in China versus the ones you have in New York?
Yeah, I think, you know, the people that we've seen migrate to the suburbs have been primarily those who can afford to, who live maybe in New York during the peak of the COVID crisis. We know there's a real estate boom in the Hudson River Valley, you know, but I don't know that it reflects the general condition or the broader condition. We also have proven to a pretty large degree with, you know, I don't know, pick Los Angeles or other cities where urban sprawl, where suburbs sort of were gradually consumed into a larger flat mass. The mobility solutions haven't proved that to be successful living. So I don't think that until we start to look at the other factors in terms of what makes a great urban environment, I think the point John's making about mixed use is an important one. You know, if you look at, let's assume you had a fairly rapid de-escalation in land value in a major city, maybe part of that adaptive reuse is to bring back different types of urban, of more natural spaces to infuse with the concentration of, you know, vertical density. And so, you know, I think that there's probably, rather than it being a polar argument of either it's the suburbs or the city, I think it has to do with making better cities. You know, you mentioned the urban developments in China. You know, in Asia, within 8 hours of Singapore, we have 5.4, I think, billion people out of the 7 billion on the planet, most of which are under 30. And so the attraction to come to cities may be there for employment and opportunities. At the same time, unless those cities are livable, you're going to see what happened in China, which most of the people who were supposed to be coming from the farms to the city, they voted with their feet. They just declined to participate. And so unless those cities are designed in a way that make it much more appealing to habitable space, you won't see much conversion. And I think, you know, while we talk a lot about the tactics of the various technologies that are available, I think we need to have some fundamental planning, you know, rethink around what makes a livable city.
If I could just weigh in, I mean, I totally agree with you, Tim. I mean, I think, and that's one of the reasons why at our foundation, the New Cities Foundation, we, you know, for some years now, we have completely banned the use of the 2 words smart cities, because we feel very, very strongly that it reduces the conversation around urban life to technology, and it's human beings that are at the core of it. So we've started focusing a lot more and very seriously on urban well-being and trying to define what are the metrics for urban well-being. So, you know, work-life balance, good mobility, you know, air quality, public spaces, etc. So we prefer to think about that as that's what we're here for, is to improve well-being in cities. And, you know, cities, you know, they can't just be efficient and deliver services efficiently. They have to have that, you know, kind of emotional bond. I mean, they should not be places which make you sick, which unfortunately cities often are.
Yeah.
So I hope, you know, I do feel that the conversation is beginning to change towards, you know, the well-being side of things, which is essentially what you're saying.
So we did just have a question come in that's related to this topic. So I'll just so everybody knows as well, please feel free to submit questions. We'll do our best to answer all of them. But this question is, do we have any examples of cities taking advantage of the effects of the pandemic to redesign quickly parts of that place that may have been deserted up until now? So the one example I gave about in Europe, some people were putting in more bike lanes. Does anybody else have any examples where you've seen cities take advantage of this during the pandemic, or are they too busy just planning for the future?
Well, I can speak from what City of Philadelphia is doing. We are a lot of them are temporary changes, but we're trying to improve the public space and make it as effective for our communities as possible. So I think a lot of cities are doing this, so we're not unique in it, but opening up our public right of way to become what we're calling streeteries, so that while we can't have indoor dining, we're providing more outdoor space for restaurants to have, you know, customers, and it's safer for people to eat that way. And then we have a program that we launch every summer called Play Streets, where we shut down one-way streets. People apply for these and they become, you know, safe places for children to play in the street. And we provide things for them to climb on and all the fun equipment that comes along with it. So we've really ramped that up as well to make sure that we could deploy it in time so that we're providing safe spaces like that.
Okay. Anybody else have a comment on that one?
Well, I think it's pretty generalized. I mean, you know, New York, here in LA, you have restaurants. It's like Paris in the summer. I mean, you have them on this, you eat in the street, and I think that's wonderful. I mean, reusing streets. I see also an uptick, I mean, something that Emily mentioned, again, in if it's not full pedestrianization of streets, it's sort of partial pedestrianization. So they really become what streets should be, and that is, they're not a single use. A street is not only for cars. It can be for kids. It can be, you can have dinner in a street. You can play in a street. You can have a chat, etc. And these different kinds of forms change over the course of a day. So I think here in LA, for example, we're seeing this, you know, what I never thought we'd see, but really community-led initiatives to limit traffic on streets, to allow people to use them better. And I don't think, I mean, even if a vaccine is developed tomorrow, then we no longer have to think about COVID. That will stay. I think there's been some sort of fundamental changes in the way people live in cities now. And, you know, I think the idea of eating on a street, of, you know, playing in the street, where you don't have to worry about your kid being hit by a car, God forbid. I think these are here to stay. We've had a taste of what life can be like in an altered city. So I'm hopeful-ish.
Hopeful-ish, okay, I like that. So I want to move on to another topic now. And if you look at the news, it's easy to get depressed about the situation we're in. But I prefer to look at it, you know, from the positive perspective. And if you look throughout time, whenever we've been in a time of crisis, we've been able to innovate and some positive things come out of it. So what do you think for cities? You know, what positives can come out of COVID-19 going forward? So Emily, how about you? Have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, no, there've been lots of positives. I think my favorite quote of the crisis has been from Rahm Emanuel, never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think what COVID did for cities, in my opinion, was that it amplified critical issues, systemic issues that we all knew were there but weren't being prioritized. And so for that, I'm thankful, because one of the big ones in smart cities, and, you know, I don't think a city can be smart until everybody has access to internet and technology. And we had a huge issue with that here, the digital divide in Philadelphia. Coincidentally, 25% of our population doesn't have access to internet and or technology. And so it became a huge issue when schools shut down in March, and we found out that 50,000 of the students did not have access to technology. So we had to quickly procure. So it is possible to quickly procure in cities, but it has to take something like this to really do it. But we quickly procured 50,000 Chromebooks and deployed those. But then we realized that the students didn't have access to technology, or to internet rather. Some of them were in transient housing, so that was a problem. And then we were also finding out that parents were using their kids' Chromebook for meetings, because this pivot to work from home created a digital divide as well. And so it just kind of kept on snowballing in terms of really amplifying how impactful the digital divide was. You know, if you think about it, you know, it's not very easy to do telehealth appointment, right? And you have to have the proper technology and access to that. And it's really important right now to not go to the hospital if you don't need to have that telehealth. And so we really worked to develop a strong partnership with various organizations and universities in the city, but also a strategy for how to address what we saw as three critical areas, which was access. So do you have internet connectivity? And that's generally where a lot of people stop and say, okay, that solves the problem, right? But it's actually also devices. Do you have the appropriate device to do what you need? A cell phone is not something you can have to do Zoom calls all day for classes, as an example. And then the digital literacy, once you get those things, you actually know how to use it. And that's something that I was really proud of. Our team pulled together a program called the Digital Navigators. We deployed it in something like 6 weeks. And it's people that are on hand through grant to answer any kind of basic questions about how to get access to internet services, and then also some kind of basic computer questions. But I think what I'm very thankful for is that a lot of these issues around equity, access, and inclusion have really come to the surface and become critical pieces of every conversation that should have already been a part of conversations, but are now very much front and center in that.
I like this because during these times of crisis, it can accelerate the pace of change. And like you said, if you can get through the procurement process that quickly within a city, it shows we can do it. So Brendan, what about you? Any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is, the 4-year model of higher education, or the 6+ year model for graduate education, is facing a reckoning. The economic model is hard to sustain, especially we're starting to understand, like through digital education, that there are different ways to, to train, reskill, upskill people in the economy, broadly across the economy. We're still in a situation where if we're trying to do this at a distance across countries, we're now realizing that even the model for taxation on digital goods, having to pay VAT on top of tuition and things like that, we're going to have to cooperate globally on this problem. It's not just an individual university's, a single university's problem. And so what this is going to do, I think it is going to drive more economic opportunity for all socioeconomic levels, because we're starting to see the totality of the educational ecosystem, for instance, in the Valley. It's everything from junior colleges to smaller colleges to the Research One universities. And so I think that's a really positive thing. It could drive more innovation in smart cities and create more economic opportunity if there's more access to this kind of training.
Very good. John, some thoughts on this?
One of the things, I want to go back to something that actually Emily said right at the start of this fascinating discussion. And that was, the pitch and pilot program in your city. And one of the things we see increasingly in some of the bigger cities, not only in North America, but in London and Paris and some other cities, are these kinds of urban municipal programs designed to pilot and test out new kinds of technologies. So one of the things here in LA, for example, a year ago, we helped put together the Urban Movement Labs, which is part of the mayor's office, with the idea that LA is a massive city geographically. Let's use certain areas of the city to test out certain kinds of technologies around urban air mobility, for example. So we've now done a very similar project that we recently launched with the city of Miami-Dade County, Miami, called the Commotion Lab Miami. And the idea is to use the 5,500 miles of roads in Miami, the airspace and the maritime channels, to test out new kinds of mobility solutions. And we see city after city. Chicago has a very advanced program like this to pilot new mobility technologies, also New York. So I think we see this happening more and more. I mean, cities are opening up to innovation like never before. And I think the fact that not only tier 1 cities in the world, but also tier 2 cities have their own Emily Yates, their smart cities people. Who understand technology and are every bit as literate in technology as, let's say, their private sector counterparts in, Google, Verizon, whoever. That's really important, because I think there had not been at all a equitable or level playing field between public and private sector. And we see that's evening out somewhat. If you look in the mobility field, which we look at very, very closely, sort of 7 or 8 years ago, Uber would just go into a city. There was no regulatory framework. Cities didn't understand connected and shared mobility. or a bird could come and just put 2,000 electric scooters in your city. There was no regulatory framework around it. The city didn't know how to speak to an Uber or to a bird or to other kinds of operators. Now they do increasingly know how to speak to these companies. And I think, so that also gives me hope, because I think indeed the future is about public-private partnerships. And it has to be. We're going to see completely new PPP models in the future that we probably haven't even dreamed of. But that will be the way we ultimately finance big infrastructure projects, drive innovation, is this sort of partnership between private and public. And so that's something that's going to be quite different, I think, in the urban landscape going forward.
Okay, very good. And Tim, over to you. So do you think that there's going to be a positive impact and we're going to have more human cities going forward?
Well, I think one of the things I would certainly hope so. One of the things that I think is probably at least being indicated with COVID is the clear interconnectivity of things. And what that means is, the best thing that could happen is that we get away from silo thinking. Part of the conditions in successful cities are creating a balance of quality of life, of economic distribution among the citizens. If you look back the United States from the 50s to the 80s, the times where we had a broader distribution in the economy so that more people were benefiting and having a better quality of life, turns out there's fewer societal issues. There are a number of factors that are interconnected that aren't necessarily being explored or developed as, looking at it from an ecosystem standpoint rather than a series of silos. And I guess that maybe it means, transforming both the physical and economic model for how cities work. We should be, looking for more balanced, for happier and healthier cities. I think the idea of health and wellness is a huge thing. It's at the basis of the COVID crisis, but the majority of people who are dying have some secondary health condition that makes them the most susceptible to the disease. So, I think the virus is teaching us all that, we need one another as well. That's the other value of a city, is the fact that we have human interaction. There are a number of things that are being brought to the surface that actually are interconnected. And I think the smartest, learning that would come from this is the fact that we're starting to see what we used to think of as siloed elements as much more of an ecosystem.
I'm glad you brought up that well-being comment, because you did mention earlier about how young Asia is. Most of the population is below 30, but we also have a severe elderly care crisis in Asia as well, because people are living longer. So we need to start incorporating these strategies in to make those later years in people's lives more manageable for them, so they don't have to go into facilities right away, do better home management, and just adapt to the way that society is changing. Because in Asia before, the parents and grandparents always came to live with the children and grandchildren. That model's changing, so it's important we incorporate these things as well.
Well, and we've seen the impacts from the virus on general livability of the planet. I mean, the planet's health has improved substantially during this time. The fact that these things are interrelated, we have to just start to recognize it's not, that we have this connectivity, and we have to be able to plan and think about the decisions we make within that context.
That's a great positive as well, because where I live, I can see across to where Indonesia is. And for the last 8 years, it's been this blur. So I can see that there's lights over there, but you don't really know what it is. Suddenly, the last few months, I can see all the individual buildings. So that's when you really realize the impact that the ways we've been traveling and everything is having on our planet. So hopefully we can maintain this, because I love having that view now. So now that I know what it is, at least. We had another question pop up here, which is quite an interesting one. And it's about the cities and public transport operators. So what is the impact going to be on them post-pandemic? Because a lot of it's unsure about how much usage there will be. So what impact is it going to be on infrastructure spending? And will there be a change in the way that cities spend on infrastructure during the pandemic and then after the pandemic? So Emily, you might be a person to start off on this one.
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's something that I think at least the transit authority here in Philadelphia, SEPTA, is still working on. We actually just wrapped up a project, a great partnership between SEPTA, the City of Philadelphia, Accenture, and Penn State's AI students, where they did an analysis of jobs that are going to transition to, or could transition to teleworking jobs, to better understand then what those impacts would be by census block along the various routes of transit and service by SEPTA, which SEPTA was very excited to have that data. So, I don't know how our spending is going to shift just now. I think right now the focus is still creating the feeling of safety in riding public transit, because it is such a critical system within a city. Again, getting to the equity component, not everyone can afford a car, and in order to get to your jobs or to your health visits or whatever, or even to quality public space, you need to be able to ride the light rail, the bus, the bikes that we have. And so I think where I'm seeing interest is creating more of a mobility as a service kind of system, where you don't have to log into various systems to get access to each mode, but rather you just pay at one point, and it makes it more simple and more effective to ride the transit.
Very good. Anyone else have some thoughts on that one?
Well, I mean, a couple of things. I mean, public transit has been absolutely devastated by COVID, because obviously, ridership has collapsed, by 90%, 60%, 70%. So with that revenue, at the same time, city budgets are being hollowed out by all of the, calls on, new services and emergency services, et cetera. So it's going to be very, very tough in the coming years. I mean, if there are grounds for hope is, there are some studies that have, from Europe actually recently, in the last couple of weeks, have shown that actually public transit, if you wear a mask, you're no more likely to get COVID than, sort of walking down the street, basically. So I think with time, people will go back to public transit. One of the things, it goes back to the discussion earlier on, is, will there be a need for these vast commuter lines linking central business districts with outlying suburbs? We don't know where the demand is going to be in the future. So I think there will have to be a look again. I think in the United States, I think the federal government is going to have to step in and rescue public transit. I don't see any other solution. But that's a big, they are in a hole, massive, massive hole.
Well, and I think, just to chime in again, to get to Tim's point about kind of the connectivity of all these systems, right? Yeah. We can't, as a government in a country, let our public transit systems falter, because that's just one of the backbones of how cities operate, right? So I think it has to be a priority in budgeting, but again, I can't speak to everybody else's budget, but we had a massive cut to our budget because of a variety of reasons. And so it's just, how do you continue to provide the basic services with a drastically reduced budget is going to be the challenge.
Yeah, huge challenge, I agree.
So I was talking to someone recently about this, and the promise of smart cities is, disease detection. And not in massive waste transfer stations or waste stations where you're processing an entire city's waste, but smaller dispersed stations where you could detect outbreaks that are more local. Improved healthcare where you have better contact tracing and detection would make public transit less threatening. But another impact of the hollowing out of budgets could be that we move to nimbler systems where we're not trying to build light rail necessarily, but we're thinking of smaller buses and shuttles that could be autonomous, that could reach more hubs and could reach further out of dense urban centers. It could be more affordable and could actually improve in the long term the public access to public transportation. So
this is going to be an interesting one to track over the coming years. So what I'd like to move on to next is to talk about what you've learned over the years. So we've all been looking at smart cities for the best part of a decade plus, if not more. So can you tell me something that you understand about smart cities today that you wish you knew 10 years ago? And I'll start with you, Emily, on this one.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, and even more convinced after having a conversation with this group, is that tech can't drive the solutions and that you have to have people at the center of it all. It has to be driven by the community, by the needs and the challenges, and then you find the tech answer to it.
That's interesting. So I did a white paper last year on smart cities, and I interviewed 30 different players in the space around the world, and nobody talked about tech as an issue. We have the tech. It's more about the other challenges, within the cities, whether it's related to governance, driving collaboration, or accepting that you need to assume a bit of risk to try out new types of concepts. So Tim, what about you?
Yeah, I guess what I wish I had known earlier was this kind of the convergence that's happening between the rate of change and the ability for us to have the rate of adoption. Then, Thomas Friedman talks about this in his book, his new book, but, the idea that, the rate of change has been increasing exponentially. So he talks about Moore's Law, he talks about the planet, or the people, but at a certain point, the change is outstripping our ability to absorb it and adopt it before it changes again. Mm-hmm. And this curve is really interesting because it's typically when there's massive shifts in fundamental systems as we reach vertical on the curve. And I think this idea that we're now at a point, let's say we have COVID, we need to fix our infrastructure, but what infrastructure do we build? Because by the time we build that infrastructure, it's already obsolete. So, I think that there's huge demands on our thinking, on our development that reflect this condition. And kind of, I wish I had seen it 10 years ago because then I could see it coming. But, in understanding that condition, it's only going to get more accelerated. And, as we get there, I think we have really fundamental shifts in the way we have to think about creating the solutions for the problems.
This is the challenge. This is why I always get concerned when cities do extended proof of concept periods. So sometimes they can go on for 2 to 3 years because you start out with something that's innovative. By the time you finish the proof of concept, the world has already moved on. So it can be challenging just to keep up with the pace of change. That's why collaboration is so important with PPPs, but across ecosystem collaboration as well. So it's everything from the education side, technology vendors, citizens, incorporating all those ideas into one. So Brendan, how about you?
I think when I started working on these like 10 years ago, I was very optimistic about people's their thoughts about change, but I'm still finding that the focus is on the built environment as an end in itself. And sometimes I get worried about that because we really need to think of our cities as, evolving, almost organic environments. And I think if you look at a city like New York, you forget that it was a completely different city 150 years ago. And we look at what it is now and that we've built this and we've accomplished it. But it's still shocking to me in a way that we're so focused on the built environment and we're not thinking about flexible systems that are going to need to evolve and change pretty rapidly in the next 50 to 100 years. And I think Philadelphia was one of the best I was going to say Philadelphia has one of the best and earliest public water systems in the country. And it's still one of the best. So, those are things we need to make durable investments, but that can be flexible and grow.
Okay, very good. And John, over to you.
Yeah, I think 10 years ago, I probably felt that technology was the solution and that, that would be the big driver of change in cities. I obviously no longer think that. So I agree with what everyone's just said. I'd like to go back to something that you said, Tim, and that the idea that the pace of change is accelerating so much that it's important people understand, communities understand technology and understand smart cities. I kind of sort of do, and I'm in the field, but it's important that cities listen to communities and listen to people and listen to citizens. It goes a little bit to the digital divide that Emily was talking about. So I think one of the important trends that's going on now is looking at, how do you get community input when you're starting a new, very highly technological process in the city, a new kind of shared mobility system. You need to you don't want to impose these things continuously on people. You need to listen to them and adapt them. So I think that sort of feedback loop is going to be increasingly important. How we use data. We could spend hours talking about that. But, the man and woman in the street don't understand that much about, the importance of open systems versus closed systems, how big data is used, privacy concerns, stuff like that. So I think we need to have more of an attempt to, one, make the talking about technology accessible, but also listen to really what people want. And, that's evolving. That's sort of government tech and, using actually, software and digital tools to better listen into, what people need and want and understand.
That's good, because when we start doing that, we start creating more human cities and drive that human experience, which will keep Tim happy. So, and actually it'll make all of us happy. So that's a great thing.
Right now.
All right. Well, listen, we've just hit the 1 hour mark. So what I wanted to do is say one final thank you to all the wonderful panelists today. This has been a really great discussion, really interesting topics to go through. I almost think we could do a webinar on each one of the topics we covered and breaking them down. There's just so many interesting things that are going on right now. But anyway, I also want to thank Spark Labs for setting this one up. Remember, there's going to be another one on the future of mobility on August 19th. We'll also be putting this out on YouTube, so we'll be sharing the link out. Please let other people know about it. And once again, thank you to all the panelists, and I hope everybody has a great morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are.
Thanks.
So take care, everyone. Thanks again.
Thank you.